Okay, first class for First Samuel. I'll say right away, I don't know how long this will take. I don't know how long we'll be here. First Samuel has 31 chapters. So, at least 31 Sundays, give or take a few. And some of you were here throughout all of Romans, and that took us 9 months. That was 16 chapters. Now, and granted, Romans is kind of tricky because we spent a whole Sunday on 3 verses sometimes, and that's what happens when you're reading Paul and the Pauline theology. But a book like this is more historical. It's a historical narrative talking about historical events. So there may be times, I wouldn't be surprised, where we could cover 2-3 chapters maybe in a class simply because it moves a lot faster. We're not stuck in the depths of Paul's thinking and stuff like that. But I would expect probably till the end of the spring and maybe into the summer. So it's a big book, and we'll see. We'll see. I have no idea. We'll see. A couple people have mentioned that when we finish, should we do 2 Samuel? And let's just see how this goes, and we'll go from there. We'll see where we are midway through, and yep.
Because I read 2 Samuel, because I just misunderstood what you said.
Yeah. Well, and originally it was one book.
Right.
So how we understand it as 1 and 2 Samuel, that's not how it's like in the Hebrew manuscript. It was one complete book, the book of Samuel. It's the only reason it's divided is because it was translated differently and they broke it up in 2. So.
Isn't it also that it was too big to write on one scroll?
Yes.
The 1 Samuel's one scroll and 2 Samuel's the second scroll.
Yeah. When the Septuagint was translated, that's what happened. Yeah. So again, it may be easier because we're reading a little bit of historical narrative, but in some respects it will be difficult because we're talking about a book that was written about events 3,000 years ago in a land foreign to us, in a language foreign to us, with a culture foreign to us, and with customs foreign to us. So we will have to bridge the gaps, and that's where the hard part will come in. And it's important to study the Old Testament. So when we finished the church history series over the summer, I was thinking, what are we going to study next? And I knew I wanted to do an Old Testament book because we had done Romans prior, and it's important to go back and forth, I think. Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians 10 when he's talking about the story of the Exodus, and he said, these things happened as an example for us, right? And in Romans 15, he writes, remember, whatever was written in earlier times are for our instruction. So 1 Samuel is for us, though it's 3,000 years later. This is an important book in the Old Testament and in the history of the Jews because it shows us a very important transition in the Jewish people's history from the time of the judges to a united monarchy under the kingship of Saul, David, Solomon. And 1 Samuel kind of showed how we got there from the period of the Jewish people being under the rule of all of these judges where there was no king to how did they get from there to a feared, respected, well-known kingdom throughout the land under the mighty King David and King Solomon, who would build this massive temple where all the ancient monarchs would come to visit. So 1 Samuel sort of described the growing pains as to how that all took place. Okay, so before we start, anytime you start a new book, you want to go through the basic stuff. Who wrote it? When was it written? Why? Setting, and stuff like that. So, the author of the book and the date of the book, we don't know. And, when we studied Romans, we knew who wrote Romans because he told us, Paul, an apostle of Christ. And when virtually every book in the New Testament, we know for the most part, especially all the letters, because they identify themselves. 1 Samuel, we don't know who wrote the book. There have been some theories. Jewish tradition ascribes it to either Samuel, Nathan, and you remember Nathan, he was the prophet who confronted David over his sin with Bathsheba, or another prophet, Gad. The reason these names are thrown out is because of a verse in 1 Chronicles. It says this, now the acts of King David from the first to the last are written in the chronicles of Samuel the seer, the chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and in the chronicles of Gad the seer. So Jewish people, Jewish scholars associate one of those three as the authorship of 1 Samuel. We know, though, Samuel did not write 1 Samuel because he dies in 1 Samuel 25, before David ever becomes the king. And again, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel was written as one combined book that covers the period of a couple hundred years. So Samuel more than likely didn't write this book because his death is recorded in it.
Ryan,
Yes.
what's the difference between a prophet and a seer?
It's really the same thing. It's just two different words used.
Okay.
Yeah. So we also know this. This was probably written after the division of the kingdom of Israel. So you remember the very first king of Israel was Saul. After Saul, David. David after David, Solomon. Solomon after Solomon was his son Rehoboam. Under Rehoboam, God divides the kingdom in two. So no longer are they a unified monarchy under one king. They're the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And Samuel seems to indicate that whoever was writing this is writing this after the period because he hints at stuff like this. Well, I'm sorry, the author, not Samuel. For example, in 1 Samuel 27, he said this, Achish gave him Ziklag that day. Therefore, Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. And that phrase, the kings of Judah, indicates this was written at the time period when Judah was a kingdom. Long after Saul, long after Samuel, long after David, and long after Solomon. There are other things as well, such as mentioned as to how many years in total David reigned. Of course, the death of David is mentioned at the end of 2 Samuel and such. So we don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. Some have speculated it was written as far after these events, such as in the middle of the Babylonian captivity, which would have been about 400 to 500 years after the events of 1 Samuel. And, you know, that verse in 1 Samuel where it talked about the chronicles of Samuel, the chronicles of Nathan, and all of that, whoever wrote it may have very well used their material, Samuel's materials, to compile this book, but we're not sure who wrote it, and we're not sure when. And again, this book is primarily a historical work of narrative, covering historical events and historical people. The three primary characters are Samuel, David, and Saul, with some minor characters here and there, such as Hannah, the mother of Samuel, Eli, Jonathan, the son of Saul, and such. But those are the primary three ones that this book covers. The time period that we're in is 1105 BC, of course, to 971. And just to give you a little bit of perspective as to what was kind of going on in the world, the famous Trojan War of Troy took place around 1184 BC. So that's sort of the time period we're in. And again, 3,000 years ago. So 1 Samuel will cover about 135 years, and again, of an important transition from the judges to the monarchy of Israel. When 1 Samuel opens up, it opens up in the time period of the judges. You know, the Bible is written in sort of a chronological sense, but not always. But Judges is, I think, like 2 books before 1 Samuel, right in between Ruth there. But this is the time period that 1 Samuel opens up in. And you remember the story of what happened. Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt into the Exodus. They wander the desert for 40 years. Moses dies. Joshua leads them into the promised land. They go into the promised land. He defeats all these different enemies, and he's a great leader. Joshua dies, and when Joshua dies, the book of Judges opens up, asking the question, who is now going to lead us now that our beloved commander Joshua is dead? So God appoints what's called judges to lead the tribes of Israel. And judges, of course, you know, they're not old people wearing long robes. These are rugged military commanders. They're strong men, and Deborah, of course, who was a woman, but they're military commanders. They're the ones that would lead people into armies and into battles. They were strong, rugged, the kind you would want to lead you into a battle. And, you know, some of the famous ones, Gideon, you know, the story of Gideon and him leading his 300 men into battle. Deborah, of course, and maybe the most famous one, Samson, right? Samson and all of his strength. And then Samuel will be a judge, and we'll get to how that'll play out. He's the last judge before the monarchy begins with King Saul. If you know Judges, you know Judges is a very dark book because the time period under where Israel is under all of these judges is dark. It's dark, it's evil, a lot of them were corrupt, the people were corrupt, and it was really a cycle of the Israelites coming back to God in worship and then falling back into idolatry, depending on how some of the judges would lead them. Some were better than others, but a lot of them were bad. There was that phrase in the book of Judges that says, in those days there was no king. And that phrase probably tells us that this Judges may have been written after the kingship too, for the author looking back on that time period. And in those days there was no king. And the very last verse of the book is, in those days there was no king, and the people did whatever they wanted, whatever they saw was right in their own eyes. And that verse pretty much summed up the book of Judges. Whenever you do what's right in your own eyes, that's what happens. It reminds me of what Chesterton said. He said, the problem when you don't believe in God is not that you don't believe in anything, but it's that you will believe in anything. I'm sorry, it's not that you won't believe in nothing, but that you'll believe in anything when you don't believe in a God. So whatever you do is right in your own eyes. If everybody is right, you do whatever you want. And that's really the setting of Judges. So by the time that 1 Samuel opens up, the priesthood is corrupt. The Ark of the Covenant is in and out of the tabernacle. Sexual immorality is rampant among the priests, and the judges were dishonest. So just a couple of examples. In chapter 2 of Judges, Israel moves into the Canaanite land, and they begin adopting the practices of the Canaanites, which of course the most infamous one was child sacrifice to the god Molech, where they would burn their children alive to this god Molech who didn't even exist. And of course, I think looking back, we understand that was just demonic influence among the Canaanites, right? In chapters 6 through 9, Gideon murders his fellow Jews because they refused to help him in battle. Then he makes an idol using the gold that he wins in battle, and after his death, everyone begins worshiping the idol. Jephthah, one of the judges, almost sacrifices his own daughter in the spirit of victory in battle. And then probably the worst story you remember in Judges 19, the story of the Levite with his concubine, where he allowed this concubine he has to be exposed to a mob and to be gang raped and abused all night long. And then when he goes out to find his concubine, the concubine appears to be dead. So he cuts up his concubine into 12 pieces and sends them out to the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, that is a picture as to the setting that what the Israelites were in right now.
What was the purpose of him doing that? I've always read that story and go, why does he cut this woman up and mail her out? I mean, what was the purpose of that? To see what happened, or what was he trying to do?
I'm not sure if it tells us, yeah. And there's anger after it. A lot of them become angry about it. It doesn't really quite go unnoticed, but yeah, as to why he did that, I don't really know if it tells us.
Crazy person.
What's that?
Crazy person.
Yep,
Well,
sometimes that's the
she
reason.
obviously had no value because she was sent out to be gang raped and murdered, and then he cuts her in pieces and sends her, and it's like what?
Right. Well, and this was a Levite, a priest.
Right.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and that's just, yep. When you think about the transition, I want to see if this works. If you're a visual person, maybe you'll appreciate this. But in the Lord of the Rings, in the Fellowship of the Ring, and you remember the film, if you've seen it, you remember the opening scene. It starts off with Cate Blanchett's line. She's like, "The world has changed, and I feel it in the water." That's my Cate Blanchett impersonation. And then there's this 5-minute scene of this giant war, and the imagery is dark. It's evil, Sauron in the ring, and it's 5 minutes of, it just kind of puts you down a little bit because it's dark, evil fighting. And if that's what Judges is, and you think back to the film, all of a sudden it changes, and you hear that Howard Shore music of the Shire, and this scene opens up, and it's all green, and then there's a little hobbit sitting under a tree, and it's very peaceful all of a sudden. And then you start to feel good again. That's sort of the transition here. Judges is all the dark, evil fighting going on, and as we transition to 1 Samuel, you don't have Frodo sitting under a tree, but you do have this young woman's Hannah, and you just picture that Howard Shore music in the background. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to watch the movie. if for no other reason, because it's, cinematic masterpiece, right? I mean, you're a film guy, right? I need a second vouch here,
It's really long.
It is long, but hey, art is long sometimes, right?
That's
So
right.
that's the setting as to where we're in the history. And that's where 1 Samuel opens up. All right, any questions on that, on background setting, the context as to where we're in?
How long have you been waiting to use Lord of the Rings in this class?
You can't rush it. So when it fits in, it
Well,
fits.
hear more.
Oh, probably. Why not? Yeah. All right, let's read it, and I hope we can cover the whole first chapter this morning. 1 Samuel 1:1. Now there was a certain man from Ramathim Zophim, from the hill country of Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. So right away, the first verse introduces us to Elkanah. Elkanah is not really a major figure in the story. He's going to disappear relatively shortly, but he is the father of Samuel, as we'll see. He's from Ramathim Zophim, and that's really just a small village in the middle of nowhere that no one would have ever heard of, and probably at the time nobody really knew where it was. And he has 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Hannah was the first wife because she's mentioned first. However, Hannah has no children, but Peninnah does. So he is a polygamist. He has 2 wives, right? We understand in the Old Testament it's kind of tricky because God seems to allow polygamy, not in a sense of endorsing the practice, but he doesn't seem to punish it as much as he would some other sin. Now, in the New Testament sense, we would understand that if anybody would claim to be a Christian but be a polygamist, they wouldn't be a Christian, right? Just the same way as anybody would claim to be a Christian that identified as any other sin. We would say, no, you're not a Christian because a Christian does not identify himself as a Christian sinner, right? A Christian polygamist or a Christian adulterer or a Christian homosexual. That doesn't work. We don't identify ourselves with sins. And the design of marriage, as we all know, it's clear from the beginning. Genesis 2 makes it clear. Jesus reaffirms it in Matthew 19. Paul reaffirms it in Ephesians 5. It's not a mystery. It's always been one man and one woman. And when you mess with that design, that's what brings problems into marriage, such as this one. And it could very well be that Elkanah had no intention of having 2 wives. He very well could have married Hannah. But when it became apparent Hannah was not able to produce children, he married again Peninnah. Because obviously in those days, it was very important to produce offspring, to produce your line, your heir, especially if you're a male and a father who wants to continue your line. Abraham did the same thing, you remember. Abraham was promised a son by God. Abraham had no excuse because he was told by God himself he was going to have a kid. And he just ran ahead of God's plan and said, well, I'll do this myself. Right? And he took Hagar and had a child with Hagar. So Abraham really had no excuse. The only one who seemed to have gotten it right was Isaac. Isaac in 24, when his wife was barren, it says, Isaac prayed for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him. So he learned from his daddy's mistake. And we know, obviously, in those times, there was social stigma of not being able to produce children if you're a woman, as well as family element of stigma, but there was also theology going on behind it as well. Hannah is no doubt a pious Jewish woman. She understands the scriptures, and we'll see that next week when we look at her prayer. So she no doubt knew Deuteronomy 7, which says, quote, you shall be blessed above all peoples, and there will be no male or female barren among you or your cattle. That is a promise given in Deuteronomy 7. It's one of those promises where God says to his people, if you obey me, I will do this. It's that sort of thing. So Hananiah knows this, and she's a pious Jewish woman, and you can just imagine her thinking, what is wrong with me if God had not blessed me with children? Have I done something wrong? Because he said, you will be blessed above all people, and there will be no barren among you. Let's keep reading verse 3. Now this man would go up from his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests to the Lord there. When the day came that Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portion to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters, but to Hannah he would give double portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. Her rival, however, would provoke her bitterly to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. It happened year after year, as often as he went up to the house of the Lord, she would provoke her. So she wept and would not eat. Then Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep, and why do you not eat, and why is your heart sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? So they live in this town, and they go yearly to Shiloh to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts. This is actually, by the way, chronologically from the Old Testament, the very first time the term Lord of hosts is used. And you know, Lord of hosts, it's a title of God. It's Lord of all the armies, the commander of the armies, you know, the commander of the angelic army. Two sons of Eli. Eli is a priest there. Hophni and Phinehas, they were also priests. And we will see later that they are corrupt priests. They're sexually corrupt. They're sexually immoral. Now when the day comes that Elkanah sacrificed, he gave portion to Peninnah, and to Hannah he would give a double portion. The portion were for them to provide for their children. So it would make sense that he would give a portion for Peninnah to give to all of her children. But it makes no sense that he would give Hannah a double portion because she has no children. But he does that because it says he loved her. But the Lord had closed her womb. By the way, I skipped over this for a second. The reason they go to Shiloh is because Shiloh is where the tabernacle is and where the Ark of the Covenant is. The tabernacle, we understand, is the place where God, Yahweh, literally dwelled. The temple is not built at this time, so Yahweh has to dwell somewhere. So he dwelled in this tabernacle where the Ark of the Covenant is there as well. So once a year they would go and they would sacrifice there. So that's what they're doing. He loves Hannah, but the Lord had closed her womb. This is interesting because all throughout not all throughout the scriptures, but throughout the scriptures we read about Jewish women being barren. But seldom do we read that it is God's doing that they are barren. But here that's the case. The reason Hannah can't have children is because God closed her womb. Now Hannah didn't know that. She didn't read 1 Samuel chapter 1. She doesn't know why she's barren. But that's the case. Sometimes God takes responsibility for the deformities of people. He admits that. Let me read in Exodus 4. This is when Moses is on Mount Sinai and he is conversing with God. And God tells him, go to the Pharaoh, tell him, let my people go, and I'm going to, do all of this stuff. And Moses basically has all these excuses. You remember, he said, well, what if they don't listen to me? He said, well, what if who should I say when they say, who sent you? What am I going to say? And he has all of these excuses. And one of them is, look, I don't speak well. And God responds in Exodus 4:11. He says, who gave human beings their mouth? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or who makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Taking responsibility for some of the deformities we have. Now, only God knows whether or not someone is his doing, or sometimes we just have problems because we live in this sinful world, right? Only God knows. But here we know that the reason Hannah can't have children is because God closed her womb. Her rival provoked her bitterly because God had closed her womb, and it's happened year after year. Who knows how long it's happened? And obviously, you can just imagine how this destroyed her to the point where she wept and would not eat. And Elkanah has a very interesting response. Why do you weep? Why are you sad? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? But evidently it worked, because look at verse 9. Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. Any questions and thoughts so far? Okay, now verse 10, she is greatly distressed. It literally is, she was bitter to the soul. Bitter to the soul because she has no children, and she prays and makes a vow. If you look on your maidservant and give me a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall never come on his head. This is probably a reference to the Nazirite vow, right? The Nazirite vow, you can read about that in Numbers 6. It was an Old Testament vow that a man or a woman could take to basically completely give your life in service to God. Now, ideally, we should all do that, right? But this was very specific to the point of priestly work and matters such as that. And it came with certain specific guidelines. For example, if you were to take the Nazirite vow, you could not consume wine, you could not eat raisins, and you couldn't get a haircut, and you cannot go near a dead body. So just specific guidelines if you wanted to take the Nazirite vow. Samson, we know, took the Nazirite vow as well, as did John the Baptist. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. It would appear. Now you look at verse 12, she made a vow. So verse 12, as it came about, she continued praying before the Lord. Eli was watching her mouth. As for Hannah, she was speaking in her heart, but only her lips were moving, so her voice was not heard. So Eli thought she was drunk. I don't know what kind of person you have to be to see someone praying where their lips are moving, and it just would obviously look like they were praying, but your first thought is that they're drunk. You know, I think that says something about Eli, and you'll see the comparison. Eli is a man of status. He's a priest, he has prestige, he has the status, he had the symbolism, but as we'll see as the chapters go on, he does not have the heart for God that Hannah has. And many commentators point out that Hannah interacts with God much more intimately than Eli does. Hannah calls God by very personal names, such as Yahweh, while Eli refers to God as spiritual titles, such as we'll see the God of Israel. And it's really a compare and contrast sort of deal, where you have this unnamed peasant woman probably in Hannah, and Eli, who appeared that God would use him more, it would seem, because he's the priest, yet God is going to intervene in the history of the Jewish people through Hannah and not through Eli nor his sons, as we'll later go to see. We keep reading. So Eli thought she was drunk. And then Eli said to her, "How long will you make yourself drunk? Put away your wine from you." But Hannah replied, "No, my lord, I am a woman oppressed in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have poured out my heart before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant as a worthless woman, for I have spoken until now out of my great concern and provocation." Then Eli answered and said, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have asked of him." She said, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went away and ate, and her face was no longer sad. So an interesting dialogue between her and Eli, but it ends with, she goes away and she eats, and her face was no longer sad. So she makes this very specific vow to God. If you give me a son, God, I will give him back to you, right? So they arose early in the morning and worshipped the Lord, and returned again to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. The phrase "remembered her," obviously God does not have a case of divine amnesia, but it's really used in an intimate sense, almost in the way of God finally decides, now is the time I'm going to intervene in her life and give her what she's been asking for. I knew I was going to do it all along, but now is the time. That's how we should read that, as the Lord remembered her. Verse 20, it came about in due time, after Hannah had conceived, she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked him of the Lord." I think I've mentioned this before, but let me just give you a couple of examples here. In the Old Testament, when you read of some of their names, whenever you see these sort of prefixes at the end, it's always in reference to the name of God. So Samuel, God hears, for Elohim. Joshua, Jehovah, Daniel, God is my judge, Elohim. So keep that in mind when you come across different names. Whenever they end or begin in those prefixes, that's what's going on in the Hebrew. So Samuel means heard of God. So she finally had this son she'd been wanting for who knows how long. God gives her this son, Samuel. She names him Samuel because I have asked him of the Lord. Verse 21, then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. So this appears to be how she wants to keep her end of the promise she made to God, that when the child is weaned, when he is ready, I will bring him to Shiloh, and I'm going to keep him there. And he will appear, it's literally appear before the face of Yahweh and live there forever. I'm going to devote him to God by sending him to the tabernacle where he will live before God forever. And as we'll go on to see in the coming chapters, he'll begin to train under Eli until when God calls him as a prophet, as a young boy. Verse 23, Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. That's a good response. It's literally do what's best in your eyes. You know, that's a good husband response. I use it sometimes, you know. What do you want for dinner, honey? Chicken or rice, you know. Do what's best for you, babe. That way we can't get in trouble, right? Do what seems best for you. That's what he says. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she weaned him. Verse 24. Now when she had weaned him, she took him up with her. She took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and 1 ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. Although the child was young, he would probably be about 2.5 to 3. And, you know, to finish weaning is when you just finish that process of nursing the baby when they're more sufficient, not dependent on the mother for food, anyway. Verse 25, then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. 26, she said, oh, my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. Remember, this was years ago that she had done this. He's a couple years old at this point. For this boy I have prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition, which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord, and he worshipped him there. That is really an amazing act by Hannah, because how long has she wanted a child of her own, to raise as her own, and to send them off to school, and to do all the things that a parent would want to do with their kid, only she gives him to the temple and said, this child is devoted and dedicated to the Lord. For this boy I have prayed, I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. So she understood and understands, really, that the role of her as a mother, the role of her as a parent, was to completely dedicate their child to God. And in her case, that meant sending her son over to the tabernacle to worship him, to appear before the face of Yahweh, and for him to eventually grow up to be the last good judge Israel ever had, Samuel. And you know, the principle has not changed, of course. We had this morning baby dedication, right? And unless I missed it, no one subjected their child to the Nazirite vow and sent them off to the tabernacle. But second service is coming up. You never know, right?
It was Matt.
Yep. But the principle is the same in a baby dedication. You devote your kid to the Lord. You devote to raise him to God. And Hannah understood that. And what's amazing about the whole thing is, again, think back to the setting of Judges. Think back to the darkness and the evil and the idolatry and the turning from God. And God intervenes through this woman, Hannah, who is an unnamed woman, married to an unnamed man, living in a town, rural village sort of deal that nobody knows of. They were in dark times when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And you wonder that if these pious Jews, the ones who weren't corrupt, were just longing for a leader like Moses again. They were longing for the days of Moses, the days of Joshua, a leader they could look up to. And here's Hannah, and God intervenes, and through Hannah, God would send them another leader, Samuel. And Samuel would become their last judge. But it all started with pious Hannah. Pious Hannah and her faithfulness to God. And the reason for her and her faithfulness is the reason we're studying her and being encouraged by her 3,000 years later. I think that's really cool. So Samuel is now born. He's at the tabernacle. He had been devoted by his mother to worship God, to live with God, to appear before Yahweh in training, and will follow his career to the point where he then appoints the king a couple chapters later. Does anyone have final thoughts or questions?
So would she only see him once a year at this point, once she dropped him off with Eli?
What's that?
When she dropped him off with Eli, did she just see him once?
Yeah,
a year?
she'll return to visit.
Come a new.
That was my first question
New
too.
clothes every year, didn't she? Make him new little
Yeah,
clothes,
yeah.
new little, some like little garb for him to wear, a new one every year.
For
That's part of the gift
For the
she
mother,
brought.
yeah, every year when Hannah would go visit.
oh, okay. I'm not sure.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah. Yep.
So just a thought on the two different, or several translations. Most of the ones I read say that she lent the child to the Lord, where you read that he was dedicated to the Lord. Dedication means pretty much a lifelong thing. Lent doesn't necessarily mean that. Why the difference in translation?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not sure. It all depends on how the translators, translate that verb. But I think as we'll go to see, the indication is she's given Samuel to be trained at the tabernacle by Eli. And although she will return to visit him here and there, that's the way she seems to do it. By sending him off there, dedicating him to God for the service of God. But yeah, I'm not sure what translation is that?
Well, it's both the ESV and the RSV.
RSV, yeah, I don't know. That's a good point.
Like I said, also though, it says in verse 28, so now I give him to the Lord for his whole life. He will be given over to the Lord. So, I mean, I think
Yeah.
that kind of gives.
Yeah.
That's the dedication versus Lent. Lent kind of means temporary.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why it kind of confused
Right.
a little bit. That's more what I thought when you read dedication.
Yeah.
It's a lifelong.
Yeah, I don't think she'd had in mind a temporary thing, because the way she goes about it is I think she wants to send him off there to train, and then ultimately wherever that training would lead. I think that was her heart behind it.
I wonder if Lent was kind of just a way to describe that she still had ownership as mother over him, even though she wasn't the one raising him anymore.
Could be. You have something?
Yeah, we're done with that topic. When we're reading it, well, no, I mean, I don't wanna,
Yeah. No, I got
but
you.
when it talks about weaned, do we have any idea what period, how long of a period of time that was?
What period of time? Her
Said when he was weaned, or whatever the terminology was.
about 2 to 3 years.
So he was a toddler.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a toddler
Yeah.
and he got
It,
left.
it's really kind of transitioning them from the period of when they stop nursing, stop dependent on the mother, and to the point where they become a young toddler. Yeah.
Is there, I guess I'm just curious, is it necessarily 2 or 3? Because I know in different parts of the world it could be 5.
Right. No.
You
If
know.
No.
Watch the Game of
No.
Thrones,
But
Yeah.
that's an average. Yeah. 2 to 3. Yep. Yeah. He wasn't 10. You know.
That's
Well, and it says.
what I was trying to say.
Right. Yeah. And what it says in verse 24, it brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. So he's still young. Yeah.
How common was this to give your child to the priests? And is she a Levite or of the tribe of Levi in order to let that happen?
How common? I don't know. I'm not sure if that was a common thing or not. It was, the Nazarite vow was fairly common, but in terms of giving them to the priestly service, I'm really not sure.
The Nazarite vow usually something that was temporary. It's like what we think of as a fast. They would do it for 3 months.
That depends too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people did it for a lifetime,
Right.
but it was more common as temporary.
And in the case of Samson, God tells his parent to subject him to the vow. They're visited by the angel, and the angel tells them to do that. So,
Because then
yeah.
Paul does it as a temporary thing, right?
Maybe. Yeah, he does it, but it's you'll never read something like they took the Nazarite vow, but they'll do something associated with it. Yeah. So.
Yeah, there's like some. I'll find it for you.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, you're talking about the same thing, dedication. Yeah, and I look at today and children and the way they grow up, and like we did this morning, dedicating the children to the Lord.
Yep.
I'm thinking of as he grows up and he becomes his own person, is he bound by his mother's vow, or can he go his separate way then? I mean, it's just a different thing. I like a child today, when he becomes his own man, he'll do whatever he wants.
Right.
Pretty much.
So, like you're asking, when did that process take place?
Well, it might take into account the translation of Lent,
Right.
until he gets to a point where he's taking over his life as his own.
Right.
And maybe it's just until that time, and then he can maybe, I don't know, decide to go ahead and honor his mother's vow. But it wasn't his vow.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So yeah, and we know that at 13 they're considered a man.
Yeah.
So at that point on, but he gets called by God specifically to become a prophet and a judge very early, when he's still a young boy. So that kind of, I think, would answer your question. And he probably at that point doesn't see it as this is what my mother did, but this is now what God has called me to do, because my mother had dedicated me to God. Now God has called me. And that's in chapter 3 or 4. And I think at that time, I don't know if it says or not, but he's still a young child.
Don't you think she raised him the whole way to prepare for this? Because I know if I'd taken one of my girls at 3 and dropped him off with some guy they didn't know and said, bye, I'll see you in a year, that would have not gone over well. So
Yep.
there would have had to have been preparation in some way. And I wondered if he wasn't even a little older, that she could reason with him in some way.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, this is what God, I don't know, but it's just to drop off a toddler with someone they don't even know is not usually going to go over real well. And it doesn't usually raise a well-adjusted person, so.
Yeah, it could be, but times were different then
They
too.
were different
Yeah.
then, of course,
Yeah.
but I just wonder if she didn't from the start prepare him
Right.
for this is what your purpose is, and it was
Yep.
always, you know, when you are at this age,
Right.
we will take you
Yeah.
in.
Yep.
Also, I mean, Eli certainly wasn't the example of a good parent.
No, he wasn't.
I mean, he raised these two reprobates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right,
You
his
know,
Yeah.
sons
so
were
it had
horrible.
to, God's intervention had to be.
Yeah. You're right. Yep.
That's a good point about that. Hadn't thought of that. But he did raise
So that's pride coming in, which you wouldn't have a pride in Samuel, he would have a pride in his own children.
Yeah. Yep.
Not my take.
Yeah. Well, and I think about how long has she wanted a child, and then, but you know, she loved God so much that though God will give me a child, I'll do this to give him back. But all of these questions that will be answered as we read in the coming chapters, in terms of what their relationship would end up being like, how Samuel would develop, how he would grow. So he gets called as a prophet in chapter 3, and by chapters 4 and 5, he's the prophet. He's the ruler of Israel until the people rebel against him, in a sense, and say, we want a king. And he goes, all right, let's go get you a king. Anything else? Okay.